Thank you for coming. I mean, we can cover anything, right? The world. So we were going to do the oceans of the world, one by one. No, we're gonna shoot a little bigger. Let me start by introducing our esteemed panel here. We're very lucky. I'm going to try to mix up my notes and come this way. By the way, the printer at the hotel didn't work, so this is going to be a miraculous recitation here. My old friend Peter Baker, the White House chief White House, the guy at the White House for the New York Times, and an old friend. Susan Glasner, a staff writer for the great New Yorker, and together they've written terrific books, the best one ever on James Baker and the new one, The Divider, Trump in the White House. I highly recommend it. Professor Eddie Glaude, the McDonald Professor of African American Studies at Princeton, his book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, won the 2001 Stowe Award, 2021 Stowe Award. And my fellow Irishman, who shares with me, never having written a book, but has an incredible career in public service, about 8 or 10 years in the Congress, and is now our special envoy to Northern Ireland. So let's have a big hand for the panel here. My name is Mike Murphy. I'm only here because Henry Kissinger was too expensive, but I'll try to make do. Next year it'll be ChatGPT doing my job here. So, the world. Let's take a little tour. I'll do that to kind of start us off, and then we'll have a freewheeling conversation. How is the world right now? Well, good news and bad. We have a war in Ukraine that's probably exceeded 250,000 casualties, with nuclear threats now looming. China has a new leader, a right-winger like me would say dictator, with more power in one person's hands than the days of Mao, with a much more aggressive and powerful China behind it, including a military that our own Joint Chiefs of Staff are telling us, if we had a war over Taiwan, there's no guarantee at all that we'd win. We have a Middle East peace process that's frozen, and we have new terror violence in the Middle East. Here at home, our debt to GDP ratio is at 125%, highest in American history, higher in real dollars than when the government was paying the bills for World War II in 1945. And most projections say we could get up to, in 20 years, 185% of debt. Means the average debt right now, each of you carry $90,000. So our Congress has responded to that by threatening to default on our debt. Kind of tricky. I just got a telegram from some of those members saying, by the way, make sure to mention the world is flat. Our political system, where I spend a lot of time working, is almost beyond parity. The new head of the House Ethics Committee voted against certifying the election. Didn't believe it was legitimate. You all watch probably on cable television a 15 ballot vote for speaker. That's never happened before. In the budget process, to kind of call back to the point I made about the debt, we haven't passed a budget on time through regular order, the way it's supposed to be done, with the committees doing their work and funneling up, for 25 years. Banana Republic magazine says you get the cover at 26 years, so we're going to really put on a push and see if we can pull that off. Finally, the next presidential race looks like a contest between somebody half the country thinks is ridiculously old to be president, and the other half of the country thinks the other guy is a crook and a madman. And out of that, we're going to elect a solution to all this, hopefully. We have an epidemic of racial tension, police violence, gun violence, hate violence, all sorts of violence. And on climate change, the aspirations become more lofty every day. The actual performance on delivering is slipping every day, and the two do not meet. Now, quickly, because I didn't want to clear the room here, there's good news too. We've finally achieved nuclear fusion. Huge scientific breakthrough for clean energy in the future. Magnificently big. Will take 2 decades to engineer it practically, but it is enormous. We're probably going to put a man, or if NASA has any PR sense, a woman, on Mars. We are explorers. Quantum computing, most experts say, will create such breakthroughs in understanding the physical world and science, we will have more medical breakthroughs in the next 25 years than we have had in the history of humanity. Cancer will become like dentistry. to solve. And finally, if you were born in America in 1900, not so long ago in historical standards, your life expectancy was 47 years. If you were born in 2000, it was 77 years. And if you're born tomorrow, or better yet, to use the phrase, born yesterday, it'll probably be over 100 years. So we are racing forward in some ways. If you're one of the 355 or so million people here, things with disparity and problems are getting better. But there are 8 billion people in the world for whom things aren't getting so better. So with all that, I'll turn to the panel and we'll dive into text, but I'll start here with Peter. God. How's the world doing? And what do you think about where the world's going to go?
Oh gosh, just generally,
we're
I've got 45 seconds,
here.
right? Yeah.
Then we get to the metric system later.
Well, I actually like your summary. I thought your summary was great, and I was glad you mentioned some positive things, but I do think that we focus understandably about the dark moments that we are experiencing these days, and they are dark for a lot of reasons. You know, you look at what happened in Memphis, you look at what happened on January 6th, you look at what happens in Ukraine every day. There are a lot of things that are troubling us, but I'm glad that you mentioned the positive things because there are some there too. But you're right that I think we are at a pivot point in our world history right now in which, Biden has put it, a struggle between freedom and autocracy, in effect. And I think we don't know which way it's going to go, either home or abroad. And I think that's the fundamental, most profound challenge of our time, is redefining our relationship between power and the people. Where is it we want to end up? Because it's no longer a given, even here in the United States, the oldest, strongest democracy in the world, it's no longer a given that we have the same understanding of what that means.
Mm-hmm. Susan?
Well, I can see, my designated role in the family is to be the sort of glass not half full person. So I don't know if I get to do the upbeat part today, was what Peter just said, upbeat or not. But I think we are in a generational struggle and a moment of real, almost definitional crisis, because we can't even name that which is, really plaguing us right now. I think it's very fair to say that we've sort of reached the end of a lot of things, right? We're at the end pretty clearly of whatever was the post-Cold War moment. That moment is over. We are now 1 year into the largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II. This is a generational moment. Joe Biden, from the beginning of his presidency, actually, I think, has done quite a good job of articulating what the challenge is, and that it is actually a struggle between democracies and autocracies. You've heard him use that line. I guess for me, the crisis that I perceive, though, is here inside the United States. And, I've thought for, some years, really certainly since 2016, that we were looking at a political moment in the United States that has vast implications, not only for our own domestic politics, but really for what course the world is going to set right now. That the U.S. has become fundamentally an unstable and uncertain and inward-looking global superpower in crisis. And that means that we still have the habits of talking about foreign policy and domestic policy, but the bottom line is our crisis is the world's crisis right now. And I wish that, my hope is that I like the framing of this panel actually for that reason, that we're talking about the world and the U.S., sort of in an intertwined way. Right. Does that count as optimism?
Yes. Professor.
Well, we find ourselves first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to participate in the conversation. It's a delight to be with all of you. We find ourselves in a conjunctural moment, and any conjunctural moment is a moment of crisis and possibility. And just to echo what Peter and Susan said, I would offer shorthands. We are witnessing the collapse of the kind of post-World War II consensus, and we're witnessing the collapse of the age of Reagan. Those two things overlap, and there's a gap in between. What are we going to do in the face of the collapse of these kind of ideological frameworks for how we understand the world and how we understand ourselves? Then on top of that, there is a generational shift, and of course, generational language is always a kind of stand-in. It's a shorthand that is sloppy, messy. But baby boomers are not driving things as much as they used to. Yes, they are. Yes, you are. But we know that there's this generational shift on the horizon, and you have millennials and Gen Zers and Gen Y, these folk who've had a different kind of experience in the United States and in the world, and they're pushing things in interesting sorts of ways. And on top of that, with the collapse of the post-World War II consensus, the collapse of the age of Reagan, this generational shift, there is this increasing divide between those who have and those who do not have. There's a sense in which the economic system that has produced a kind of class of folk who have kind of hoarded, and those other folk who are working, busting their behinds, trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and that tension is in full view. I don't see Trumpists, all of the Trump supporters as neo-fascists. Some of them just hate the professional managerial class. Yeah. And they are going to be joined by black folk. They're going to be joined by a whole bunch of folk in interesting sorts of ways. So we're in this conjunctural moment. Things are collapsing, and as a result, there's the possibility for a new imagining of how we will be together. Shorthand, ...
And Joe, you get to finish.
Follow that, right.
Yeah, right.
So beautifully said, Professor. The only slight twist that I would put on that, and I think you actually framed it very, very well, is what I've sensed now over the course of the past several years is an age-old debate that has come back once again, but it's this question of what do we owe each other, right? And that is a foundational question that goes back to our founding documents. It is through those founding documents, and that's not a question that is ever answered, right? It's a balance that is to be struck. But what I think we're seeing at the moment that we are in in this time, is just that. It's a time of transition, economically, culturally, demographically, and we've gone through those transitions before. What makes this one different is the rate of change and disruption that comes with it, right? We're no longer at a time of a horse and buggy, but it took decades for that horse and buggy to be phased out, right? And with it obviously came massive new opportunities in assembly lines and manufacturing, et cetera. But that took time. What we're seeing at the moment and in the midst of is because of some of these opportunities powered by technology. One, you can get a vaccine distributed to tens of billions of people in a year to combat a novel virus, but you potentially put an awful lot of people out of work, right? With the powers of aspects of technology across the spectrum. So how do we, in the midst of that transition, recognize that the pain is not going to be of that shift is not going to be uniform, and then what is it that we owe to each other in the midst of that transition? Because for those that are on the short end of it, they're going to cling on to what it is that they have and protect what it is that they believe in. And we, I think, are seeing that not just in the United States, but in places across the world. And that clinging to those existing frameworks, power, political power, economic power, leveraging the inequities within our Constitution to preserve them, brings this tension to the fore. And so I come back to that age-old question that is hard to answer, but what is it that we owe each other, and how do we design a system to be able to address it for this time?
I think we'll circle back to that, because I think it harmonizes a lot of the points well about how do we have a politics that can actually effectively answer, or at least serve the answer we want to that question. But I've got to start quickly of geopolitics, because there's one big thing going on right now, the war in Ukraine. So I want to dig in a little bit. I was an old foreign policy nerd, so I called my mentor in that area, Graham Allison. I said, what's the trickiest question that Ukraine raises? And of course, Graham, who's an expert in loose nukes and wrote a great book, The Coming War with China, he's always got a fastball that's brutally logic and pretty interesting, so I want to throw it out to the panel, which is, on a basic level, we know who we're all rooting for there, right? We're arming, we're paying for, we're helping the Ukrainians defend their sovereignty against a foreign invader. Good. But if you step back, here's the inconvenient question. If the stakes are as high as people say they are, the future of Europe, the West, and maybe even the international order, why are there no Americans fighting there with the Ukrainians? Well, Biden answered that question, the president did. We don't want to fight World War III over the Ukraine. But as CIA Director Burns says, Ukraine is the war that Putin cannot afford to lose. And in the end, you start hearing about battlefield nuclear weapons at the end of the end. So what's the best outcome our policymakers should drive there? If it's a cause worth fighting for, but there's no scenario that doesn't escalate us to probably a very, very dangerous situation. Peter, you were a Moscow bureau chief once upon a time. You know a lot about Vladimir Putin and how that system operates. Why don't we start with you again?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and you're right. I mean, Susan and I were there for 4 years at the beginning of Vladimir Putin's tenure. It was the rise of Putin. He was this functionary, this KGB veteran. We thought he would actually be kind of technocratic and even maybe a little boring for reporters who were looking for a good story. And it turned out to be a big story, arguably in, one of the biggest stories of our modern times was his consolidation of power and his decision to try to reassert Russia on the world stage, in effect, to if not constitute the Soviet Union, at least some version of the Russian Empire. And this goes to the debate that you have raised. What you have just talked about there is exactly the conversation they're having in the Situation Room today, right? They are trying to figure this out. How far, what is our goal here?
Right.
As the West, and our goal may not be the same thing as Ukraine's goal. Where do they diverge, and where, and how far are we willing to go? And you've seen President Biden robustly support Ukraine. At the same time, he keeps drawing limits. And then he goes past those limits one by one, we've noticed, right? No tanks, okay, we're giving tanks. No planes, we might be giving planes. And his goal, as you say, is to avoid provoking, the larger, wider war, which no matter how important Ukraine is, nobody thinks fighting World War III is a good outcome here. And they, I think, in the White House have been surprised at how far they have been willing to go. One White House person told us, he said, we thought we'd have to be doing this secretly, like, arming the Afghans during the Soviet war there. And in fact, it's been very open, very robust compared to what they had originally expected, without the negative consequences they were afraid of. But we're now having this debate, particularly over, for instance, territory. Do you say to the Ukrainians, we are with you to reestablish the borders as they were February 24th, 11 months ago? Or do we help them take back Crimea, let's say, which of course was seized by Russia in 2014? And a lot of people believe that Crimea is a red line across which you could then trigger a worse response by Putin. And that is the fundamental question they don't know the answer to.
Susan?
Well, and I think it's a particularly profound and important question because one thing you've heard Biden and his advisors articulate is a goal that Ukraine should not only, sort of win the war, whatever that means, but to have a viable, sustainable, durable peace. Can you, in fact, have a viable Ukraine with Russia occupying Crimea? One very senior official in the government who really understands this stuff said to us not long ago, think about Crimea as a permanently stationed battleship poised and ready to attack Ukraine at any given time. Is that something that the United States or that Ukraine can really allow to continue in a long term? So even if they were able to push Russia outside of the territory that it has acquired over the course of the last year, and they have had some real success there, I believe. As of the end of 2022, Ukraine had managed to take back something like 50% of the territory that Russia had taken since February 24th. But let's just even assume that Ukraine could take back the rest of the territory outside of Crimea. I think this is a really important, it's not an academic question. You'll hear a lot about Crimea, and you do need to, because the basic question is, can Ukraine be independent and viable as a state? Can Europe therefore have real security as long as Russia is illegally occupying Crimea? And by the way, Russia is illegally occupying Crimea. And that, at the time in 2014, it was a profound assault on the post-World War II order. And Putin, unfortunately, took the exact wrong lessons. He took the lesson from that his aggression worked, that essentially he was forced with sanctions to endure what he thought of as an endurable slap on the wrist. And unfortunately, that means that Western deterrent, American deterrent, off the backs of multiple presidents, I should say. This is a failure of Democratic and Republican administrations alike when it comes to Russia. But, this is an example where deterrence failed. President Biden did a great job of, making public in advance what could happen with the war in Ukraine. He warned the world correctly, in fact, that Putin was poised to invade. He said, here's the kind of sanctions that we would impose. Here's the support we would offer to Ukraine. And it didn't matter. Deterrence failed. And so I do see this as almost a definitional conflict for us. And, the one other thing I would say, Peter and I having watched Vladimir Putin in action over the course of more than 2 decades, you can pretty much check out if you're listening to people talk about off ramps for Vladimir Putin and exit ramps and what do we need to do to give him the incentive to negotiate an end to this, because I will say relatively confidently that while I don't know how the war ends, I can be pretty confident it's not going to end in a couple months' time, with a negotiated peace agreement in Vienna. That's just not how. As long as Putin is in power, I think we're looking at a very insecure and destabilized time in Russia and in that part of the world.
Yep. Okay, you're going to get double time on the next one. Yeah, so Joe's going to explain now how we get a win where somebody keeps Crimea.
Right.
Yeah.
Far be it from me to obviously contradict those other 2 comments. The only thing I would add to that, though, is I think most observers are surprised that this war wasn't over by March 24th, right? And that, at least from my perspective, one of the great successes of this administration 25 years from now is going to be looking back at what a Biden team was able to do and the ground that they were able to till with regards to the kind of warning of Europe and the EU about what was coming and NATO about what was coming. The fact that they were right, the fact that they helped kind of lead that effort while keeping, allowing Europeans to also be hand in hand with the United States in that. And you've never seen NATO more invigorated and stronger. And in fact, the fact that 2 Scandinavian nations are trying to enter into NATO, who historically had, one of which anyway, historically had a neutrality pact, is, Peter, I mean, I don't know if I had told you that 18 months ago that Sweden and Finland were trying to come in and that there was a likelihood they could get in and that there was, in fact, US policymakers that were now trying to say Ukraine should be fast-tracked in. There's no way that would happen, right? And so the costs that have been accrued to Putin and to Russia, the immigration we have seen, a brain drain that we have seen, the costs that now, as we to the extent that we can forecast this, that a President Xi is looking at from China and the prospect of now conflict over Taiwan, all of that has increased because we've seen, hey, when it does come down to some fundamental principles of that World War II, post-World War II world order, there is a willingness to defend it, which wouldn't necessarily have been so had a different result happened in that 2020 election, right? We had a president then, after President Trump, who famously derided NATO and did his best to undermine it. And you think of the consequences of this for today and what that means going forward, I don't know what that alternative looks like, but it is a very different state of the world than the one that we're looking at this moment.
I passed because oftentimes people who have access to platforms, they talk about stuff they don't know any damn thing about. Right? And so you have to be honest about what's your wheelhouse, right? And so there's some intuitive things, some intuitive views I have about this, and I'll defer to what has been said. But I also
that has never stopped a member of Congress on anything.
Right.
Or a journalist.
But I want to say that all of this, which I think is right, occurs against the backdrop of a country that is at each other's throats, and there's a question about our blood and treasure.
That's right.
Right.
And so, because remember, we framed it by the collapse of the post-World War II consensus, the role of the U.S. in that. Susan described the United States as, in some ways, this kind of child that has lost its way, in some ways, still trying to present itself as, right, a superpower, a kind of guiding force in terms of maintaining order in the globe. And here we are in the midst of this political disarray and coming out of Afghanistan, coming out of Iraq, seeing our infrastructure collapse in front of us. There's a sense in which the failure to invest in us, in the United States, that rhetoric we're already hearing among certain folk about support for Ukraine and the like. So there's a debate against the backdrop of what you've just described, whether or not the American people will actually be willing to support the U.S. playing the role that we've just laid out here.
And to your large point about expertise. I'm not going to cancel the question on subatomic physics I'm coming up with next. We're all unlicensed. But I am going to take it to domestic American politics for a minute, because that's the thing we do have some control on. And I'm very fond of quoting Google quoting Plato.
Google quoted Plato?
Yeah, because like anybody, I need a good quote, and I'd heard something like that. I wanted to get it right. Plato once said, "This city is what it is because our citizens are what they are." Have we become lousy citizens? Because in theory, we own this system. We get to vote or choose to vote. Lately, in some areas, in a toxic situation, people are being somewhat denied the right to vote. It's happening now in parts of America. So it's ultimately our job. Are we good at it, or have we become quite bad at doing the work of citizenship, because it doesn't happen for free? You've been on a ballot or two. You're a practicing politician, so Joe, I'll let you start and we'll go across. Because you have to deal with the voters eyeball to eyeball.
No longer. So there you go.
For now.
No, I don't think. So I think that statement is true.
Right.
The system we get as a result of the outcomes that we as a nation have selected, I think one of the biggest challenges to that system, and my time in office and then my time out of office has kind of clarified this for me, is that that system doesn't actually do what we say it does, right? It does not actually empower our citizens to be able to actually select not just the representatives, but the manner in which they are able to execute our wishes and desires. And so structural forces such as, once codified in our Constitution, to try to create some balance, but recognizing that the Constitution was itself a compromise from 250 plus years ago. And there's value to maintaining that compromise. There's also, they put in a form to update it because they recognize that what worked 250 years ago you might want to have a hurdle there, but might be worth trying to amend from time to time. We also have to, I think, recognize that the campaign finance reform or campaign finance system, gerrymandering, the powers of incumbency, all of these skew a political system in certain directions that mean that it is harder necessarily to have that perfect democracy. And look, that's perhaps a topic for another panel. I do come back to the fact that, good old Winston Churchill, worst form of government except for all the others.
Right.
There's no silver bullet to these solutions. There's nothing, people say, well, term limits and, public financing and all the rest of it. There's challenges there for all of them. The question is, I think, is how do we reinvigorate that system and then also engage our citizenry to understand what those drawbacks are, because they're considerable, and you're getting a system now that is much further skewed to the representation of the extremes at the extent of the average citizen. Last point on that. Yeah. The average citizen then has to engage, right? Think about it from, if you were going to go run for Senate in California, which a lot of people might, right? But that campaign, if you wanted to do that, is going to cost tens of millions of dollars. You have to crisscross a state with, better than I would, dozens of media markets. Right. You have to start engaging in that 2 years in advance, at least. You find people that want to engage in a political campaign 2 years ahead of time. The only people that do are the ones that really care about an issue. But if you're a candidate and you have to go get in front of tens or millions and millions of voters, you got to get in front of them. That's who you're going to. Yeah. And those groups then get to decide, well, are you good on my issue, or is there somebody else that's a little better? But our citizens' desire to kind of only engage in the last 6 weeks of a race, that has real consequences for those that have to run that race. And it happens for understandable reasons, but that's a challenge that we face.
Let me follow up quickly, just when you were running, how much time a day would you have to spend on the average day focused on fundraising? And this is very typical of everybody.
Oh my experience was not wholly typical, right? I served 4 terms in the House. My last campaign there, I won a Democratic primary, 95-5, and I had no Republican opponent. Wow. I then lost the Democratic primary 2 years later. So I spent a lot of time fundraising, but that fundraising was largely spent to help support other candidates across the country. I spent a lot of time campaigning that was largely spent to campaign for other people across the country. those folks, for those members that are in those true swing seats, and Alyssa Slotkin,
Right.
God bless her, I don't know what she and people like her have to do to keep that job. It is a brutal existence and experience, because you have to dedicate so much of your time on every vote and on every day thinking about how do you, knowing that your campaign finishes in November and it starts again in January or March, and it never ends.
Yeah, if you're Adam Schiff, you're looking at doing 400,000 to 500,000 a week going forward. And he's here tomorrow, or day after tomorrow, so be careful. Hide your wallet. Eddie, I'd love to hear you address this. And also, what does tribalism do? The I'm right, you're evilness, when it posts up against citizenship. It seems like it's an acid on citizenship, at least what ought to be.
Absolutely. But, this is, your question mark is an old one. There's a deep skepticism in Edmund Burke about the capacities of everyday ordinary people to govern themselves. This is the ongoing threat of democracies, of mob rule. Right? Or you can think about 1924 and Walter Lippmann's work, right, on public opinion, or his 1927 book on the phantom public. There's a sense in which Lippmann is arguing that mass democracies have produced circumstances such that Americans are too busy to acquire the knowledge to do what self-governance requires of them.
Yeah.
So they need to outsource it to experts. And John Dewey wrote a book in response to Lippmann entitled The Public and Its Problems. And Dewey's phrase in that text, paraphrasing it here, is that the best cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. And so here we have a moment where mass consumer culture has defined every aspect of our lives in so many ways. Those who have to work really hard to make ends meet. So the idea of being engaged outside of that window that you just described, Brother Joe, is difficult to imagine for everyday ordinary folk. And so you would think that the crisis would require an expansion of democracy, but what have we seen? A contraction, a kind of undermining of democratic institutions, politicizing of the court. The so-called greatest deliberative body in the world is broken. A gerrymandered House, the worry about the imperial presidency. I remember saying this to folk as people were celebrating Barack Obama signing all of the executive orders. I was like, slow your roll. This is not good, right? Because if you get someone in here who's not committed to basic democratic norms, all hell's gonna break loose.
Yeah.
And it did, right? So there's that reality, right? So the problem of democracy requires more democracy, but we're living in a moment where we're seeing literally the contraction of democracy, the undermining of those things. And why are we seeing the undermining of it is the question that we have to ask ourselves. One is obvious, kind of greed and selfishness. The other is, I think, this refusal to grapple with the idea that America, the demographic shifts in this country, that America is not a white nation in the vein of old Europe. Yeah. That diversity is not some additive value, that it is a constitutive feature of American democracy. It has always been. And how do we imagine ourselves in that way? So that's a question for a different kind of panel, but right. we can explore it. And I want to just a footnote here. I heard Brett and Frank talk about this in terms of the extremes on both sides. I just reject that language. I don't see it as extreme that folk want people to have health care. Mm-hmm. I don't see it as extreme that folk don't think you should have to pay for college. I don't see it as extreme that you should work 40 hours a week and be able to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head and dream for. I don't think that's, so I want to know what these extremes are, because I think part of the problem is that we misdescribe what's happening on the ground. And then the other part, the last thing, really quickly, is that we get into this debate, Mike, where we hold our opponents with contempt. Right. That your view, your position, indicates that you are a bad human being, as opposed to us just simply disagreeing. You can't hold that view and be a decent person. That's the conclusion that's drawn. And if that's happening, and it is happening, then it's very difficult to think of a vibrant, healthy, deliberative space so that citizens can do the work that democracy requires.
Yeah, it becomes even worse because they add moral loading. So if you're in the I'm right, you're evil equation, well, if they're evil, I can do anything against them, and I'm a hero. I'm doing good work here. It's like any screenwriter will tell you that the villain always thinks they're the hero. You know, any Bond movie, I'm going to save the world. So it gives people a license to act in ways that are seditious.
Right. And
you know, those people on January 6th, a bunch of them thought they were heroes.
No, absolutely. One of the things about small government that I've heard over and over again, states' rights, you know, it's very difficult. You hold what?
Yeah.
To hear that view and not try to smoke it out. Something else is behind that. Right? And so then we engage each other with bad faith because I don't believe that's really your position.
Yeah.
Something else is going on. And if that's happening, then democracy can't function.
Yeah, states' rights is normally code for there's something I want to do. So you've both been esteemed political reporters. You've worked under the hood of this car for a long time. So Susan, you know, not only are we lousy citizens now, but what might be incentives? You know, how do we correct this behavior? I don't think we can wait for a magic hobo to show up and say, boom, we've cured the American political system.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, the big thinkers are supposed to be the ones who tell us, you know, how to fix this mess. We're just the ones who get to describe it. And I do think that, you know, I'm glad you used the T word, frankly, in this conversation, tribalism. And I'm going to throw another T word out there because I don't think that, you know, aspects of what we're talking about here, aspects of it, we could have had that conversation, say, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 100 years ago, right? There are structural issues to our democracy that make it not really a democracy. There are factors like gerrymandering, the breakdown of Congress. You know, our friend, the congressman, can tell us, but we all know this. It's a long time coming. You know, go back and look at one of my favorite metrics for dysfunction. When was the last time that the U.S. Congress performed the basic function of passing all of the appropriations bills by September 30th, the end of the annual fiscal year? The answer is, you know, my son's lifetime has not included this experience, and he's already in college. So, you know, the breakdown's a long time in coming. But the flip side is, I'm going to say the exact opposite too, which is to say we are in a particularly unique crisis. And all of these factors were out there, but we have lit the fire, and it is raging, and it is raging uncontrolled. And, you know, that is to say that the U.S. elected not one, but two presidents in our recent lifetime who did not receive a majority of the popular vote, George W. Bush, and then Donald Trump. And where the country ended up, the Trump presidency is a very different place than where it began it. And I do think that we are looking at an ongoing crisis of one of our two great political parties at a moment in time when we still have a two-party system. And so it's not enough just to say, like, well, somehow we're going to get out of that. I don't see the evidence to suggest that that is happening. We are in a moment of what I might call the political unthinkables. It's become a parade of unthinkables. Make a list for yourself of all the things that have happened in the last few years that your 2015 self would not have believed could happen in American politics, and yet somehow we've accepted those things again and again and again and again. So I don't have prescriptions, I don't have solutions, but I think that we do have to name the problem in order to begin to kind of, you know, frame for ourselves how we might get out of it.
Yeah, the new normal is anti-normal, which is terrifying. Peter, if you can do about 4 minutes, then I got to land here.
Yeah, and I'm going to be very, very quick. I noticed we have quoted Plato, John Burke, Churchill. I'm going to quote the great philosopher Barney Frank, one of Congressman Kennedy's colleagues, former colleagues, predecessors. And what he said when people were criticized members of Congress is, yeah, the voters ain't no great shakes either. So coming back to your original point, we do own this. We own this. And I'm not going to repeat everything everybody else has said, all wise and smart, but I would then mention one other aspect we haven't mentioned, which is the media. Okay, that we ourselves have a part of this. The fragmentation of the media has obviously gone a long way toward fragmenting our society. Now, which is the chicken, which is the egg, we can argue about, but we all want to flock to that part of the media spectrum where we're going to receive validation for what we already believe. And going to tell us, yes, we're smart, the other guys are the evil guys, as you just said. And that is a fundamental change in our society. When I was growing up, when we were growing up, we had basically 3 main networks. We had a handful of big newspapers, the wire services, and news magazines, and they all had a broad agreement on the facts. And then we would take those facts on which we all agreed and then debate about what they meant. What do we do about these facts that we all agree on? We don't agree on the facts. If you watch the different networks, and I'm a participant on some of this, obviously, you will get very different fact worlds in which we don't even agree on the nature of the problem or nature of the situation. So that is a huge, huge change in our society. And I don't know how to bring that back together again because there's not a mandate at the moment. There's not a thirst at the moment for a neutral, people say I want a neutral media. What they really want is somebody to tell them what they think is right. That's what I get. I get a lot of criticism in my reporting from the left. I get a lot from the right. And when I hear a lot of people have very legitimate things to criticize, I don't dismiss criticism. I think it's very valuable for media reporters to hear. But a lot of it is also, how come you're giving any credit to the other side? If you give any credit to the other side, it automatically is wrong. And what they mean by neutral or balanced is agree with me. And that's not what journalism should be about either. So I think we have a crisis in journalism, which mirrors the crisis in citizenry and the crisis in politics.
Thank you. So they made it very clear to me, when the little light goes off, they cut the mics, and if that doesn't work, they use fire hoses. They know who they're dealing with here. But we have a tiny bit of time left, so in 30 seconds or less, it's kind of a dirty trick question, but we are talking about the world. So if aliens landed and said, new rules, you're in charge for the next 3 years, what's the one thing you try to either change about human behavior, or it could be small? Mine would be, it shouldn't take 3.5 hours on the 10 to get here from LA. But you're thought leaders, you may go bigger than that. Eddie, we'll start with you.
Plato's city banned the poets. The poets are the source of imagination. They give us the language to see the world differently. I would invite the poets back into the place.
Oh, nice. Very good.
Joe?
Come on.
Yeah, no. We're learning the rule here. Nobody ever wants to follow Eddie.
That's true. No, that's right.
I would get back to domestically, trying to reframe and build a system that focuses on that third clause of our Declaration of Independence. Right? We have fought wars culturally and otherwise over life and liberty. We have not done nearly as much to provide that pursuit of happiness. And so what does it actually mean to have a government that sees everybody, focuses on people, focuses on fulfillment, and puts in place a system built for the long-term growth rather than short-term outcome that recognizes that dignity and humanity?
Susan?
I actually, it might be a truism, but I got to say, it's all about education in my view. And we have failed our children in so many ways.
Okay. I think what we need to do is find a way to have debate, not hate. I mean, coming back to your point, conflict in a democratic society is a healthy thing. We need to have a debate about the issues that we care about that are important to us. Do we have the healthcare system we need? Do we have, the right balance in our spending? Are we overspending our children's and our grandchildren's accounts? All these things. And yet debate has been translated into hate, which is what Mike has been saying here. Basically, we are not supposed to hate each other because we don't agree. Eddie said the same thing, Professor Glaude. And I think that's, if I were the king of the world, I would find some way to focus on that.
And I'd add too, I'd try ranked choice voting to try to align the incentives a little better. And I might bring back the draft just so different people in all the bubbles in America had to spend a year or two of their life together in a peacetime draft. With that, buy their books and be nice to us. We don't have books yet. Thank you all very much. Let's have a hand for the panel.
Thank you, guys.